Good afternoon. Our nation's law enforcement officers are reeling after years of coordinated effort to defund and demoralize them by radical Democrats. Indeed, calls to defund and distrust the police have been bolstered by voices in this very chamber. Even Vice President Harris has applauded these efforts on the campaign trail and urged her supporters to bail out individuals who plunged Minneapolis into chaos and caused upwards of $350 million in destruction. Violent crime has exploded as a result of these efforts. For example, Philadelphia canceled $19 million in much-needed funding and saw 561 homicides the following year, the highest number ever recorded in their history. At least 16 U.S. cities set new homicide records in 2021. In 2024, crime is still rampant across the country. Look no further than right here in the nation's capital. From 2022 to 2023, violent crime in D.C. increased by 37% and robberies increased by 65%. In that same time frame, motor vehicle thefts rose 107%. Longtime residents, new arrivals, visitors, government staffers, and even members of Congress have all been impacted. Outside the Beltway, New York City had to deploy the National Guard within their subway system, and the FBI is launching a national carjacking task force for the very first time ever. The American people share our concern. According to the Gallup, roughly 6 in 10 American adults believe crime should be the top priority for policymakers. To cut down on crime, you have to catch criminals and bring them to justice. To do that, we need strong local police forces. But our law enforcement officers find themselves in a dangerous position. Thanks to the left's absurd movement to demonize police, many offices are understaffed and lack sufficient resources. Now they are facing increased risk, direct threats to their safety because of their profession, and all with reduced manpower. In 2023, a record number of 5,363 New York police officers were injured in the line of duty. According to the National Law Enforcement Memorial Fund, 136 law enforcement officers tragically died in the line of duty last year, including Deputy Josh Owen, not far from my home, whose name has been added to the memorial this year. In the past year in Minnesota, we have lost 3 officers and a firefighter in the line of duty. Tragedy is striking in police families all across the country. Our officers need our help, and they need it now. It's why we're here today. As tens of thousands of our men and women in blue travel to the nation's capital, House Republicans are taking up 7 measures to support them. One of the shocking trends we see here in D.C. is the rise in juvenile crime paired with the lack of consequences. Soft-on-crime policies and anti-police rhetoric have only made it harder to be a police officer today. Congress must give them the tools they need to protect their communities, loved ones, and themselves in the wake of the recklessly irresponsible defund the police movement. The D.C. Crimes Act will reduce criminal activity in the district by making it easier to bring criminal juveniles to justice and ensuring the D.C. Council cannot continue its soft-on-crime agenda. The LEOSA Reform Act expands concealed carry rights for off-duty and retired police officers, guaranteeing that they can use their training to keep America safe on or off duty. Cops have an incredibly tough job. We have an obligation to back the blue and safeguard their mental health. In that vein, HRES 1213 acknowledges the harsh realities police officers face, recognizing the mental toll their jobs can take, condemns efforts to defund and demoralize them, and expresses solemn appreciation for the invaluable role they play in our communities. Additionally, H.R. 7581 would bolster reporting requirements for assaults on officers and require the Department of Justice to report to Congress on how these traumatic incidents affect the mental health of our men and women in blue. We would be remiss if we did not address the strain President Biden's self-inflicted border crisis has placed on law enforcement. From retail theft rings to targeting, beatings, and outright murder, migrant crime has exploded in every corner of the country. With that in mind, HRES 1210 condemns the tremendous burden, the border crisis has placed on officers. And our Police Border Act requires the Attorney General to submit a report on the crisis's impact at the federal, state, local, and tribal level. And finally, HR 7343 responds to the terrible mob attack by 14 asylum seekers on 2 New York City police officers and countless other cases like it, amending the Immigration and Nationality Act to provide for the detention of certain aliens who commit assault against law enforcement officers. Additionally, we will consider one item in support of Israel in its continued fight against Hamas, Iran, and the Houthis. When President Biden made the decision to withhold weapons shipments to our greatest friend, major non-NATO ally, and lone democracy in the region, he usurped congressional authority. Once again, he signaled to hostile actors under his leadership, America does not pose a serious threat to their mission. Israel deserves nothing less than our full and steadfast support while they wrestle with a myriad number of threats to their continued existence. The Israeli Security Assistance Support Act rebukes President Biden's unilateral decision to pause arms transfer, ensure prompt delivery of the transfers, and reasserts congressional support for Israel. I look forward to the opportunity to advance these pro-law enforcement measures and to set the record straight on America's support for Israel. I will now yield to our ranking member, Mr. McGovern, for any remarks he wishes to make.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair, and wow, after that opening statement, let me just say to anybody who's watching this hearing on C-SPAN, please don't let the Chair's comments dissuade you from coming to visit the nation's capital. Thousands and thousands and thousands of people come to this building, this Capitol building, every single day to learn about our history, to meet with the members of Congress, and they do so without incident. So please don't be frightened away from coming to visit Washington or talking to your representatives. It is National Police Week, which means we are back with several messaging bills that do absolutely nothing to actually keep people safe and instead highlight the Republican Party's total hypocrisy when it comes to law enforcement. Many of the measures before us today demonize migrants and continue to push Republicans' tired, unconstructive, and baseless attacks on President Biden. It's sad and a total waste of time. But let's be honest, that's what Republicans are good at. Now, let me remind everyone, there was a comprehensive bipartisan border security bill in the Senate. If House Republicans wanted to take action on the border, they had a chance. Instead, they killed it. And when we have a non-binding resolution to support law enforcement and oppose efforts, and then we have a non-binding resolution to support law enforcement and impose efforts to, quote, defund the police. This resolution is almost comical, considering just last month, the Republican Study Committee, which all but one of my Republican friends across the dais are proud members of, released a proposal to gut the Community-Oriented Policing Services Program, the COPS program, which provides grants that support hiring, retaining, and training officers. And that just scratches the surface. 21 Republicans, including 3 members of this committee, voted against awarding police officers the Congressional Gold Medal for their service on January 6th. And I noticed in the Chair's opening statement not a mention of the Capitol Police officers who protected all of us and our staff on January 6th. Over a dozen Republicans voted to fire 2,000 Customs and Border Patrol police officers in May 2022, including 3 Republican members on this committee. And over 50 Republicans voted to cut federal support for local law enforcement agencies in September 2022. They voted to fire 400 cops and cut crime prevention grants by an average of $1 million per state. Republican members have called to abolish the FBI, the Department of Justice, and the ATF. So as I see it, the only political party in Congress actively defunding and challenging the police is the GOP. Now, meanwhile, Democrats want to keep communities safe. We want to address gun violence in our schools, an issue I hear from police officers all the time, but yet silence from my Republican colleagues. We want to invest in programs that get to the root causes of crime. We want to make sure that police aren't put in situations that they aren't trained to handle. And we know the key to improving safety in our neighborhoods is not to use law enforcement officers like political pawns. Now, sadly, that is what every single one of these law enforcement-related bills does. Additionally, before us is a bill called the Israel Security Assistance Support Act. This radical bill would cripple our national security apparatus and run counter to longstanding policy and law. This bill basically gets rid of human rights checks and balances already in place on arms transfers. And it would interfere with any administration's ability to comply with U.S. obligations under international human rights and humanitarian law. And by the way, 3 U.S. presidents have threatened to pause military aid to Israel. 3 Republican presidents, Dwight Eisenhower, Ronald Reagan, and George H.W. Bush. And all three times it happened during a moment of crisis. And this should not be a partisan issue. It should be obvious that if you want U.S. military assistance, it doesn't come with no strings attached. If our taxpayers are paying for it, they ought to know that it's not being used in a way that runs counter to our laws and our values. And Madam Chair, let me just say, you know, we can be friends with Israel while also expressing our anger and frustration with the policies of the Netanyahu government. His bombing has been, in my opinion, indiscriminate and wrong. And I, for one, think we ought to tell him that we don't support his decision to invade Rafah, one of the most heavily populated areas in Gaza. We are talking about tens of thousands of civilian casualties, over 1 million people hungry. Where is our humanity? And I don't care what country kills civilians. It is wrong. It is against U.S. law to use our weapons to violate international humanitarian laws. And by the way, we do have a law that says that if a country frustrates the delivery of humanitarian aid to civilians in a conflict, that basically we are to freeze that aid. There's a famine happening right now in Gaza that it is amazing to me that so many of my friends on the other side of the aisle seem indifferent to. And there are people who are literally on the verge of starvation who have nothing to do with Hamas, who have nothing to do with any violence against the Israeli civilian population or against anybody. And so at some point, we have to make sure that what we send to any country in the world is not being used in a way that, quite frankly, violates international humanitarian law, and our own values. So I, again, regret that that's what we're going to spend our time with on the floor this week. But again, my friends are in control, and it really is quite sad what we're seeing unfold here. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. McGovern. Without objection, any prepared statements that our witnesses may have will be included in our record. And I would like to welcome our first panel, Chairman James Comer and Ranking Member Jamie Raskin from the Committee on Oversight and Accountability. Chairman Comer, I welcome your testimony.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And good to see you, Ranking Member McGovern. I urge the Rules Committee to grant a prompt and appropriate rule for the House's consideration of H.R. 7530, the D.C. Crimes Act. In reporting out H.R. 7530, the House Committee on Oversight and Accountability holds that Congress must act to exert its constitutional responsibility to oversee the District of Columbia and make certain necessary amendments to the district's criminal code. The Committee on Oversight and Accountability has held 3 hearings with D.C. officials. Various committee members have also met privately with D.C. officials to discuss the crime crisis in our nation's capital. Throughout this work, one thing has been made very clear to us: the progressive policies of the D.C. Council are simply not working. Last year, this Congress successfully blocked the D.C. Council's revised Criminal Code Act of 2022 by passing the bipartisan House Joint Resolution 26, the first law passed by this 118th Congress. That was a great first step towards addressing rising crime in D.C., but that only kept the problem from getting much worse. The bill we are considering today expands upon that work. The D.C. Crimes Act overturns targeted portions of the D.C. Council's Youth Rehabilitation Act by amending the definition of a youth offender from a person under the age of 25 to under the age of 18. Let me emphasize D.C.'s current law. Currently, D.C. Code allows a criminal under the age of 25 to be given the same leniency that is afforded to minors. This bill requires that we treat adult criminals as adults. To further address soaring juvenile crime in the district, the bill would require the D.C. Attorney General to create a publicly available website that tracks juvenile crime data. This data will inform Congress, the district's elected officials, the Metropolitan Police Department, the public, and others on the severity of juvenile crime in the city. Finally, the bill prohibits the D.C. Council from amending its sentencing and criminal liability laws, locking in place current D.C. criminal law, and leaving Congress as the sole authority to amend such laws in the future. The D.C. Council would have succeeded in implementing radical soft-on-crime policies if it were not for the bipartisan effort of this Congress to disapprove the legislation. Even Democratic Mayor Bowser vetoed that progressive criminal reform package, only to see her veto be overturned by the council. This committee is committed to its constitutional responsibility to oversee the district. We cannot allow further pro-crime policies to be put in place while this crisis continues. Citizens of D.C. and visitors to our nation's capital deserve to feel safe. This bill is a great step towards ensuring our capital city is safe. Again, I ask the Rules Committee to grant a prompt and appropriate rule for the House's consideration of this legislation, and I welcome the committee's questions. I yield back, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and Mr. McGovern. The D.C. Crimes Act is the fourth bill the majority has brought to the floor in this Congress to try to overturn laws enacted by the Council of the District of Columbia. It's called the D.C. Criminal Reforms to Immediately Make Everyone Safe Act of 2024, which would be quite a magic trick. This act is even more radical than the other bills that they've brought forward overturning the legitimately passed laws of Washington, D.C. This one doesn't simply overturn current D.C. law, but it permanently strips Washington, D.C. of its authority over criminal laws generally. This legislation represents the largest rollback of D.C.'s legislative authority to govern itself in nearly 30 years. At a time when the 700,000 tax-paying, draftable citizens of Washington, D.C. are seeking political equality with all other American citizens through the statehood process, this legislation is a serious insult and affront to the people of Washington. Now, it's part of a general effort to attack and undermine and vilify Washington, D.C. Ex-President Trump has repeatedly called for the federal government to take over the District of Columbia. Legislation has been introduced to abolish the D.C. government, and the D.C. Crimes Act is part of this campaign to demonize Washington, D.C., its locally elected leadership, and its local laws. Now, my colleagues think that the D.C. Crimes Act shows that they're tough on crime. Far from it, they don't seem to realize that the bill prevents the elected council of the District of Columbia from ever increasing any criminal penalty, including for murder, carjacking, rape, child abuse, you name it. The bill amends the D.C. Home Rule Act to say that the District of Columbia Council may not, quote, enact any act, resolution, or rule to change any criminal liability sentence in effect on the date of the enactment of the D.C. Crimes Act of 2024. The bill does not define the term criminal liability sentence, which is not a term of art either in federal criminal law or District of Columbia law. But despite the inartful drafting, the language is clearly intended to prohibit the DC Council from ever changing any statutory criminal penalties. It therefore likely prohibits the DC Council from creating any new criminal laws altogether. So I don't know whether or not this was a mistake or this was intended, but it clearly prohibits the DC Council from increasing any criminal penalties, which is what the District Council did recently in legislation that was passed by the Council of the District of Columbia. It increased several criminal penalties. That would be now outside of its legislative authority under this act. And it appears to me that it prohibits the DC Council from creating any new criminal laws altogether. So perhaps it's just a messaging bill, and it's just meant to send some kind of ambiguous signal to the people of Washington, D.C., but I don't think it accomplishes what the authors intended to accomplish. And as I said, I think it's an insult to the city where the nation's capital is located. And I will say the chairman mentioned the specific purpose of reversing provisions related to the DC's Youth Rehabilitation Amendment Act of 1985, which allows the courts in DC to use sentencing alternatives for a person who's 24 years old or younger. Some states have similar legislation that set it at 18 or 21. My state is one that sets it at a lower place. South Carolina is one of the states that mirrors DC in giving courts the power to consider youthful offenders at age 24 for differential treatment under their laws. And in South Carolina, someone who is treated that way at 24 or 23 or 22 may be sentenced to no more than 6 years in prison. In DC, they can be treated as a youth at 24 or 23 or 22, and they could have an open-ended prison term of 20 years or 30 years or 40 years or 50 years. And I'm just giving that as one example of a state that has a more permissive and open-ended system than the District of Columbia does. So it's not clear to me exactly why the target here is put on Washington, D.C. In any event, the legislation is written in such a way as to prevent D.C. from increasing statutory penalties or developing new statutory offenses, and this is the kind of ham-handed result we get when we try to pass a messaging bill just to vilify and disparage the people of the nation's capital. Thank you, Madam Chair. I yield back to you.
And thank you both for your thoughtful comments. I will defer questions, and I would yield to Mr. Roy.
Thanks, gentlemen. Thank you for appearing. Mr. Comer, the ranking member, Mr. Raskin, just referenced a whole lot of assertions about what this would do or not do as it relates to limiting the increase penalties and efforts, by the city council. It's like kind of trying to limit, it's like putting a limit on my son voluntarily doing more chores or something. It's just not going to happen. Can you walk me through your response to what the current city council is doing? And the young man who walked out with an AR and lit up a car with like 26 shots and just got released.
Yeah, I mean, you've seen, we've all seen the interview for the former police chief says that, they've got a problem. Some of these people have been arrested 7 or 8 times for the same crime. They've never gone to prison. So the DC Council, the current DC Council hasn't demonstrated any ability to do anything other than be soft on crime, be more lenient on crime. If they want to work with Congress on having a policy that's tougher on criminals than your home state of Texas, which I would assume is probably as tough as any state in America, then we would love to work with them on that. We've worked with Mayor Bowser on lots of legislation that hopefully the Senate will be passing soon that would allow the Department of Interior to lease to the city of Washington, D.C. for 99 years, the old RFK Stadium where they can build a brand-new state-of-the-art football facility for the Washington Commanders with private money. So we've worked closely with the D.C. Council, but we have a crime crisis here, and this council has done nothing but demonstrate a soft-on-crime policy that's led to out-of-control crime, and we believe that what we did initially in a bipartisan manner, passing House Joint Resolution 26, which ironically was the first bill this Congress to make it all the way through the House, the Senate, and President Biden's signature. We believe this is a positive step forward because their definition of juvenile is a problem in holding people accountable when you have people right at 25 years old that are being treated as minors in court rulings. It's just created a situation where it almost incentivizes young criminals to continue to be repeat offenders. So we believe this is good, solid legislation. I disagree with what he said.
Didn't we have one of our own members of Congress get carjacked about
We've had
10 blocks
several.
south of here?
I think there were Democrat members too. And then Rand Paul had a staffer
stabbed, right? Other staffers, I think, have been
and our
injured.
staff, I don't know about your staffers, but I have several staffers that live in Navy Yard, which is a pretty, I think, growing up in the foothills of Appalachia, the Navy Yard looks pretty prominent to me. And it's, lockdowns on a weekly basis there. They call that we can't come to work yet. There's a lockdown, the building's locked down, there's criminals, there's carjacking, we got a problem in Washington, D.C. with crime. And, every intern I have, their parents call, are you sure? I worry about my kids. And I'm like, just, can't be out late at night. Where are you going to live? And it shouldn't be that way in our nation's capital.
We've had other members assaulted. We have a particular problem with juvenile crime in the District of Columbia right now. Is that correct?
That is 100% correct. And they talk about it all the time. When they defend their soft on crime policies, they say, well, we have a juvenile crime outbreak. Well, it's because the definition of juvenile here goes all the way up to 24 years old and 364 days. So, and to answer your previous question, just a point I want to make, 2 members of the D.C. Council are currently facing recall efforts because they're not taking crime seriously. The people of Washington, D.C., outside the political bubble and the Washington Post, are concerned about crime outbreak. And we've heard from those people, and we're trying to react and create a situation where criminals are held accountable.
Right, and isn't it like about a third of the carjackings are juveniles?
That's right.
And the city has steadfastly refused to address the issue, right? And so I think the question before us as members of Congress, it's our nation's capital. People around the country want to come here. They want to be safe to come to their nation's capital. The capital was set up for a particular reason. I've had a number of, thoughtful and engaging debates with the ranking member about D.C. and its status, but it is the capital city. Right. It was created intentionally to be the capital city, and we have a particular both responsibility and ability to deal with those issues as Congress, right? There are no federalism barriers here.
That's right.
There are no kind of prudential considerations about, the constitutional limits of our power as members of Congress. We can decide what we think ought to happen to the nation's capital. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And as such, Congress can act and can ensure or take steps to ensure that the people who live here, work here, the members of our staff, members of this body, members of the executive branch, and most importantly, the millions, I don't know the exact data, of visitors that come to the city every year are safe, which right now I think there's a increasing concern of a lack of safety for people who come here. And I remember the 80s, early 90s DC when I would come here as a young person, not 18 years old. I'd come here, and there were real concerns about where you'd go in D.C. And there are a lot of bipartisan efforts to clean up D.C., a lot of bipartisan efforts to ensure that crime was being prosecuted, and for various faults. I mean, Marion Barry had his faults, but there were some, about trying to find ways to ensure that we could prosecute crime. The main point is, this should not be a partisan issue, but increasingly appears to be. And I think the whole point this week, as we talk about our law enforcement community, is not just the District of Columbia, where we have a very direct responsibility, but certainly at least in talking about the billions of dollars of funding that go out, I would obviously be one that would say we should be constraining overall funding, given that we don't have any money to give. We're $34.5 trillion in debt. But to the extent that there are, burn grants, JAG grants that are going out through the Department of Justice, what are these cities using them for? What is the city of Austin using it for when the city of Austin is whacking the police department and we're now down 500 officers in Austin? So to your kind points about that, the state of Texas takes crime responsibly, we do as a state. Some of our cities less so. Austin's one of them. And so, look, I'm certainly supportive of taking whatever steps we need to do as Congress. Again, there are no federalism limits or restrictions. And so, I hope we'll proceed with legislation to deal with the crime in D.C., and I yield back.
Thank you. I recognize Ranking Member McGovern.
Thank you. First, Chairman Comer, you said it in your opening statement and in the letter that you sent to the Rules Committee that you request an appropriate rule for this legislation. What is that?
Appropriate rule that we hold criminals
Is it an open
accountable.
rule or closed rule or amendments, or what is an appropriate rule? What are you asking for?
An appropriate rule.
Well, what is the definition of that?
A rule that is appropriate. This is a rule this is the Rules Committee. We want an appropriate rule to go on the floor to where we can do our job and hold
Well, what's
criminals
your opinion?
accountable.
What is your opinion, since you put it in your letter and you put it in your opening statement? What is your opinion of what an appropriate rule is? I mean, would an appropriate rule be a closed rule?
Whatever the Rules Committee deems appropriate.
Yeah, well, yeah, that's, then, I mean, because I asked the question because you used the word appropriate. You could have just said, I request a rule, but you said an appropriate rule, and maybe the chair of the Rules Committee can tell us what an appropriate rule is. I'm not, my Republican friends like to use that, but I don't, no one can define it for me. I mean, I don't know what, maybe it's hiding behind one of the statues in the Capitol or something, and we can go look for it, but I'm just curious. I mean, you're asking us to bring a bill to the floor, and you ask for an appropriate rule, but you can't define what appropriate is.
I mean, with all due respect, Mr. Reagan-Barry, this is a very serious issue, and I think you're trying to make a joke out of it. And I go through this in Oversight Committee with Raskin's little lapdog Moskowitz, but the people in Washington D.C. are furious with this out of control crime in Washington D.C. The House Oversight Committee has legislative jurisdiction over Washington D.C., and we are trying to do what the people want and make this city safe for its residents and all the millions of tourists that come here every year.
Well, anyway, I appreciate that, and I just want the record to reflect that you use a word in your letter and in your testimony that you can't define, which,
I did define it.
Yeah, you just
An
said appropriate means
appropriate rule.
appropriate. I don't,
Okay.
again, I don't, let me, who's the author of this bill?
This is Byron Donald's
All
bill.
right, where's he from? He's from Florida? Mr. Raskin, are you aware that in Florida, adults can be treated as juveniles up to 24?
I believe that's the same rule that DC has, and
Right, yeah.
both of those are more liberal rules than we have in Maryland,
Right.
but we want to leave it up, I think, to each state and local government to decide for itself.
I guess the question is, why does the author of this bill think it's inappropriate for DC, but it's okay for his home state of Florida?
Well, but I wish my friend Mr. Roy were still here, because I really wanted to respond to some of the things that he said that go
Go
right
ahead.
to your point. But I do believe that there's an effort here to scapegoat Washington, D.C. I mean, my friend from Texas that seems to be completely unaware of everything that Mayor Bowser in Washington and Chairman Mendelson, the chairman of the council, and the 13-member city council have been doing to fight crime in the city, which is part, of course, of a nationwide wave. And in fact, they've had real practical effect, positive effect. Total crime in D.C. This year is already down 16%. Violent crime is down 25%, and homicide is down 20%. So several months ago, they passed something called the Secure D.C. Act, which would be illegitimate under the legislation that our friends on the GOP side have brought forth today. They increased the criminal penalty for possession of a sawed-off shotgun or a ghost gun. And I know some of them don't like legislation relating to ghost guns, but in D.C., they brought a criminal penalty for it. They increased penalty for possession of a machine gun. Again, I know some people don't like that, but the people in D.C. decided to do it. They increased penalty for repeat sexual abuse. They enhanced sentences for crimes of violence committed in the parks of D.C. and in recreational property. They increased and enhanced sentences for crimes of violence committed against vulnerable adults, people with a mental disability or older people. They enhanced sentences for crimes of violence committed against rideshare drivers, transit operators, metro rail station managers, and employees and passengers. There's been an epidemic of crime against people who drive buses and metros across the country, and they took action against it. They also created a whole bunch of new offenses for possession of a firearm with intent to sell. Again, I know some of my friends who fashion themselves Second Amendment champions don't like any legislation like they passed in D.C. that criminalizes the selling of firearms. They created a new offense for strangulation. They created a new offense for directing organized retail theft. They created a new offense for possessing a firearm with a removed or altered serial number. They created a new offense for firing bullets in public. They created a new offense for the unlawful discarding of a firearm or ammunition outside of the law. Again, that may or may not be right for Maryland or Kentucky or Minnesota, but that's what they chose in D.C., and they're taking action. And I just think it's an insult and an affront to fellow Americans, albeit unrepresented by voting members in the House and the Senate, to just blindly overturn all of their laws, accuse them of doing nothing, accuse them of not caring about the public safety and public welfare in their own jurisdiction, and then make it impossible for them to create any new offenses. And I'm starting to think maybe it's because so many of their offenses have to do with the problem of gun violence, and maybe that's why they want to essentially legislatively disarm the people in Washington, D.C.
Well, I appreciate that, and I wish when they talk about crime, they talked about gun deaths. And the top states for gun deaths are Mississippi, Louisiana, New Mexico, Alabama, Montana, Missouri, Alaska, Arkansas, South Carolina, Tennessee, Wyoming, and Arizona. But for whatever reason, they don't like to talk about that. Mr. Raskin, let me get this straight now. So our Republican colleagues portray this bill that is before us as tough on crime. Let me ask you a couple of, I'll make this quick, so yes or no questions. Would this bill that we're dealing with right now, that what they call the D.C. Crimes Act, would it permanently prohibit the D.C. Council from increasing the penalties for murder, child sexual abuse, rape, carjacking, and every other crime?
Yes, and my friends have not denied it.
Okay. It strikes me that this bill not only prohibits the D.C. Council from increasing or decreasing criminal penalties, but could be construed to prohibit the D.C. Council from establishing any new crimes at all, since D.C. could not, quote, change any criminal liability sentence. Creating a new criminal penalty could be construed as a change. Do you agree with that?
I absolutely agree, and you could only create a new crime if it did not have a sentence attached to it.
So you mentioned in March the D.C. Council passed the Secure D.C. Omnibus Amendment Act, which increased penalties for, among other things, gun crimes, such as possession of a machine gun and child sexual abuse. It also created new crimes such as strangulation and firing bullets in public. Is it true that this bill, that we're talking about here today, would have prevented the D.C. Council from passing the Secure D.C. Omnibus Amendment Act?
Yes, and it seems like several of their new statutory offenses related to gun crimes and crimes related to gun violence, and that might be part of the motivation in trying to wipe out their legislative authority.
And as you know, this Congress, I think by any measure, is dysfunctional and can only seem to get around to bringing over the finish line must-pass bills. So under this bill, would Congress be the only entity that could increase or decrease statutory penalties in D.C.?
Yes.
Now, former President Trump has repeatedly called for the federal government to take over D.C., and I think my Republican friends like this power game that they play. I mean, they could actually give D.C. more representation in Congress with enhanced voting rights for our delegate, give her the same rights as we all have, and maybe even talk about 2 U.S. senators. But he has talked about taking over the D.C. government. Legislation has been introduced to repeal D.C. Home Rule Act. Home rule has been under greater threat in this Congress than in a generation. Should D.C. residents be worried that a Republican Congress, and God forbid, a Republican president, should they be worried that they could abolish the D.C. government entirely?
Well, that should be among their worries, given the hypothetical you've just offered, yes.
Yeah, and Madam Chair, I mean, Mr. Raskin, when he began, he talked about how the crime rate in D.C. has gone down. Just so that there's no misunderstanding, I want to ask unanimous consent to insert in the record the Metropolitan Police Department 2024 year-to-date crime comparison as of today, May 14th, 2024.
Without objection.
Did you have something you wanted to add, Mr. Raskin?
Well, but I would just say this, I think, not just with respect to D.C., but with respect to horizontal federalism generally, I think that we should be cautious about looking at other states and seeing that they punish this or that offense less severely than our own state, and thereby call them soft on crime. In the District of Columbia, for example, there is a maximum penalty for armed robbery of 30 years. In the chairman's home state of Kentucky, it's 20 years for armed robbery. Does that make the people of Kentucky soft on crime? Well, I would reject that. I would say that they are responding to whatever they think the various legislative factors are. For unarmed robbery in D.C., it's 15 years. In Kentucky, it's 10 years. So it's 50% higher for both armed robbery and robbery in the District of Columbia than it is in Kentucky. We've had conversations in committee before about carjacking. The maximum penalty for carjacking someone in Washington is 40 years. Kentucky doesn't even have a carjacking statute. The most you could get someone on would be first-degree robbery, which is 50% of that time. And please, I stand corrected, Mr. Chairman, if I've gotten any of those facts about your state wrong.
Oh, that's right. We don't have carjacking.
Really? Because I just found a case in March from your state in the neighborhood of St. Denis in Louisville, where there was a serious carjacking.
Lou City.
Oh, actually, that was May. That was this month, May 7th.
If there's a carjacking in Kentucky, it'll be in Louisville, I can assure you.
There's no carjackings outside of Louisville in your state?
I'm sure in the course of history there's been some, but you have one a day in Washington, D.C., sometimes 2 or 3 a day. And with armed robbery, the burglar's there's a lot higher chance if a burglar's gonna try to rob someone in Kentucky, in rural Kentucky, that they're gonna.
So is that an argument to lower the penalties?
Because
That's why there are lower
Kentucky
penalties?
Yeah.
merchants, many Kentucky homeowners practice their right to bear arms, and that's a disincentive for burglars to commit armed robbery in Kentucky versus cities where they have excessive limits on guns. So the gun issue goes both ways. It can also be a detriment to crime.
But in any event, my point, Mr. McGovern, was simply that the people in Washington, D.C., which is, of course, not part of my jurisdiction, but it is under the jurisdiction of the Oversight Committee, the people in Washington, D.C. are taking their crime problem seriously, as I'm sure the people of Louisville are and the rest of Kentucky are. And there's crime all across the country. And apparently what they've been doing in Washington, D.C. has been working, as they've had fairly dramatic reductions in violent crime and in homicide.
Right. So under this bill, basically, I mean, the D.C. Council could not even increase penalties without Congress doing it for them, which I think, and this Congress can't even, pass what to have for lunch, never mind, serious legislation of any kind. Did you want to add one other thing?
Well, I mean, that's what American federalism is about. And the district constituting the seat of government, far from being the colonial plaything of those of us who come from other states, it should be accorded the same kind of deference that we accord the other states in terms of them making their judgments. By the way, my staff is finding a whole bunch of carjackings that took place outside of Louisville. There's a town called...
It would be in Louisville. It would be in Louisville. If there are carjackings in Kentucky, they'll be in Louisville.
do you know of a town called Hebron?
That's the suburb of Cincinnati.
Well, that's not,
Oh, I see. But it's in the state of Kentucky nonetheless, right? It's a suburb of Cincinnati. Okay, well, they found one recently there. It seems like there are some carjackings outside of the border of Louisville, and I'm sure that the people of Louisville would want me to correct that misimpression.
okay, well, I appreciate your answers to my question. I think this is a joke, quite frankly, that we're doing this. And again, this is par for the course. With that, I yield back.
Thank you. I would yield to Mr. Langworthy.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Chairman Comer, I welcome back. I think our colleagues on the other side of the dais would like us all to believe that the concern of rising crime in D.C., particularly youth crime, is purely a House Republican concern. The crime issue and the larger issue of violent crime have we seen from residents here in the District of Columbia?
The what?
What sort of outrage have we seen from the public as a whole?
We get calls constantly from, in every meeting I have with residents from Washington, D.C., a lot of people we meet with on a daily basis up here that are representing different advocacy groups, they live in Washington. And they're all concerned about the out-of-control crime. Our staffers are concerned about it. The parents of we all have young staffers here. They're all concerned about their safety and well-being because of the excessive out-of-control crime. And Representative Langworthy, I want to make a point. If you'll remember, when we went through HJ Resolution 26 in here, where we rescinded the Washington, D.C. soft on crime policy, we went through this same debate, the same talking points that the ranking member of the Oversight and the ranking member Rules Committee said this bill was unnecessary, it was overreach, and it was a joke. 30 Democrats joined with Republicans on the floor to pass it. Then it passed the Senate overwhelmingly, and Joe Biden signed it into law. So we've already been down this road once, and I think it's clear the American people, the residents of Washington, D.C., the American people, the visitors to our nation's capital want to see this out-of-control crime in the nation's capital city dealt with, and that's what we're doing here with this bill.
That's great. Thank you, Chairman Comer. Many of their Democratic colleagues, they like to distance themselves, or at least try to, from the defund the police movement. But wouldn't you agree that the current villainization of cops, the soaring rates of attrition, the uptick in violence against cops, and general demoralization are seen most acutely in cities and states run by Democrats?
Absolutely. That goes to the point where Mr. Raskin was pointing out the crime statistics in Louisville. That would be very consistent. I agree 100%.
Yeah, and wasn't this attrition, this demoralization, the villainization, and all-out assault on law enforcement officers essentially the objective of the defund the police movement that's been embraced by the far left?
Absolutely.
Thank you very much, Chairman Comer, and thank you for the work of the Oversight Committee on highlighting Washington, D.C.'s crime crisis and doing something about it. I'm proud to serve on the committee under your leadership. This administration and Democratic-dominated governments in Washington, D.C., New York City, and elsewhere have catered to this movement to defund the police, which has translated to terrible rates of attrition, demoralization, and numerous assaults and murders of law enforcement officers. And today, the left has achieved what they sought out to do for years. They've villainized good, hardworking men and women in blue, and they made it possible for those who keep our community safe. They've made it impossible for those who keep our community safe to do their jobs. And there's a reason that the family of the slain NYPD officer, Jonathan Diller, told New York Governor Kathy Hochul that she has blood on her hands. The American people know who is responsible for the destructive pro-criminal policies that have left our streets less safe, our law enforcement officers without the backing that they need to do their jobs. So thank you very much, Chairman Comer, for being here today. And with that, Madam Chair, I yield back.
Thank you, and I would yield to our colleague from South Carolina, Mr. Norman.
I just want to thank the panel for being here, James. Appreciate your work on this. You know, this has a, when you see a Henry Cuellar that gets his car attacked, when you talk to law enforcement here, the Democrat policies are just not working, that coddle the criminal instead of the victims. I'm a real estate developer. These stores operate on low margins. We're now getting law enforcement to go to the chains particularly and tell them that, you know, this $1,000 free giveaway that you see in California is spreading. And what D.C. has is unbelievable, particularly being the nation's capital. And it's only going to increase with, and I don't need to see the statistics, you can tell it. You talk to these officers off record, they're demoralized. When you see a Marine who saves a woman and him get prosecuted, it's insane. And so this is, I think the good news is the public's kicking back, and it's groups like what y'all are, oversight hearings that you're having that are highlighting it. I will say people are thirsty for some consequences. They're tired of just reading, as Maria Bartolomus grilled my representative Russell Fry, when are you going to do something? When are you going to follow through and make sure somebody gets punished? And they're tired of hearings without consequences. So how can we back you up to push this and give the Americans some hope, because they're losing hope in the judicial system? Now, under Biden, it's been demoralized. It's been, it's been taken to an extreme left level. Look what's happening to Donald Trump. It's insane what's going on. But how can we help you get some kind of consequence, and at least get it before these leftist judges that have been appointed by Obama and, of course, Biden now?
That's a great question. You know, in all of our investigation, not just dealing with Washington, D.C., everything in general, we have faced obstruction from government agencies that I think is unprecedented in requesting information from the Department of Justice, from the FBI, from various government agencies. The House Oversight Committee, the majority members, I think 20 out of 26, we signed a letter to Tom Cole, the new chairman of the House Appropriations Committee. We have to hold these agencies accountable with the power of the purse, as you and Mr. Roy know as well as anyone. Accountable, we've told them accountable if they're not going to comply with basic requests for information that, quite honestly, should be made available, most of them, by a simple FOIA request. So yeah, it's been very difficult in this endeavor to hold people accountable at the highest levels in the government because of the obstruction that we face. Now, with this D.C. issue here, I think this week, Judiciary and Oversight have a good, real good group of bills that will be tough on crime, that will assist our law enforcement officers on the front lines trying to keep America safe. So I think we've got a good week ahead of us this week.
Well, we got a report in South Carolina. We got 173,000 illegals in the country, in South Carolina. 45,000 students will be filling the classrooms. Can't speak the language, don't know the culture, don't have any visible source of income other than what the government is giving them, the Biden administration. So anything we can do, Americans now don't expect us to win every fight, but as we've told the speaker, we want to at least fight.
Absolutely.
And,
amen.
And so thank you,
Thank
and
you.
I yield back.
Thank you. I would yield to my colleague from New Mexico, Ms. Fernandez.
Well, thank you, Madam Chairwoman. How nice to see you in that chair. You know, I'd walked in and I thought we were going to be talking about having the Congress dictate to a local district what to do with the criminal laws so that people who are not elected by those residents would be dictated. And here we are talking about things like immigration around a D.C. sort of bill where we're not respecting local decisions, right? It strikes me that when my colleague kind of goes on about immigrants in his state, he fails to realize that those immigrants in his state are basically keeping up the economy, right? They are working in the jobs that American citizens don't take. And so, and we had recent reports from Social Security, how thank you, immigrants, because without your participation in Social Security, we would not be solvent for a few more years. We need to do a lot. Social Security 2100, I'm in on that bill, so we could fix it. But it also strikes me that I walked in on the debate just as, I just was wondering what was being picked in your state. It's turnips, collard greens, kale. Those are the kinds of things that, hardworking immigrants, undocumented and documented, pick. Backbreaking work. But criminal conduct, it strikes me that the only reason you get indicted is because there is probable cause and lots of hard work to say we think we might convict you in front of a jury. Now, some of those cases against the former president have not gone forward, and I know that the work that you're doing in oversight and judiciary aren't going forward, mostly because there just isn't any there, right? And we had they've had months and months to look at this, and we haven't seen anything. I really don't have any questions because
Would you yield, Ms. Langer?
Sure, dear colleague.
Okay, let me just, you say they're carrying their own weight. I really don't know how you're saying that. In South Carolina, education cost alone is $586 million. Police and legal corrections, $135 million. There was an article in the Epoch Times, the small towns, particularly in Texas, where all border states are being deluged with, and in Mr. Nadler's state, New York. Look at what they've done to education system there. It's unsustainable. And I don't know how you say they're carrying their own weight. The fact that each household in South Carolina, they don't make these things up. It's $377 per household annually. So all I would say is, if you asked, you say that I can't imagine legal immigration everybody is for. You got to have some way you can have some way to monitor who's coming in your house. And as Mike Pompeo said, they're in the gates now. We've got over 40,000 Chinese nationals.
Thank you, Mr. Norman. And I would point out that we actually had a bill, bipartisan bill, the modernization workforce bill, and the farm worker modernization workforce bill, which Republicans killed. But going back to the issue at hand, like I said, I didn't really have any questions. We seem to have veered off from the topic, but I don't know if you want to respond to anything you heard.
There is one thing,
Ranking Member.
Congresswoman Leisure-Fernandez, thank you very kindly, and I love the freewheeling nature of the Rules Committee. I wasn't prepared to talk about the immigration issue, but the distinguished gentleman from South Carolina raised an issue that's close to my heart because it's something I worked on when I was a state senator, which is organized rings of retail theft. And in Maryland, we passed a law against directing organized retail theft. And I suppose that's something you'd be interested in. I mean, it's these criminal rings that are sending people in and robbing stores and coming out. I don't know if the gentleman is aware that that's precisely the kind of legislation that would be invalidated by the bill before you. The District of Columbia Council just passed that and created new criminal sentences under it. There's nothing in this legislation that deals with that particular offense, but that's something that has come up and that's, been something we've been troubled by in Maryland, and I'm sure other states. You want to have the local government being able to respond to those things. But what this legislation says is that the District of Columbia Council cannot alter in any way. It cannot increase criminal sentences. It can't reduce criminal sentences. It can't create new crimes with sentences just because Congress knows best. And that seems dubious to me, and it seems like a massive intervention with home rule and a real diss to the people of Washington who've been going through the process of responding to these kinds of criminal events. So I just thought you should know about that. There are jurisdictions that are taking action on precisely the problem that you identified. Please, by all means.
I yield you time, Mr. Norman.
Thank you.
Yeah.
How do you respond when the mayor, Merrill Bowser, would not intervene with, I forget which campus, maybe it was in George Washington, to stop the peaceful protests that were tearing up buildings? Why would she not lend the police force to help that out, help the college out?
Well, as I understand it, she sent the police in, and they broke up the encampment. That's my understanding. We were going to have a hearing on the whole thing, but the chairman canceled it. So I don't know any more details other than the DC police did go in.
It was after 14 days, and only after we were going to hold a hearing and make her have to answer questions to the American people as to why they weren't adhering to the request of the university president. The George Washington University president requested that the police go in and remove the encampments. These were peaceful protests, but they were trespassing. They were intimidating Jewish students, and 20+% of the student population at George Washington is Jewish. And they were begging for help from the police department, and they didn't until the morning of the hearing. They finally cleared it out, which the hearing was going to be 100% about why Washington hadn't cleared that encampment out. And that's why the hearing was canceled. But I would be curious as to what the ranking member's position. Did you support?
I thought the hearing was about anti-Semitism too,
No,
which is why I
it-
was so
it was the
disappointed.
hearing-
I didn't think it was just about that one event. But that's why I was so disappointed that you canceled it.
What did you support? Whose side were you on? The university president's side requesting help from Washington D.C. police, or the mayor's side?
The
Did you
witnesses should
support
be
the mayor's
questioning each
decision?
other. We have
I'm happy to
I
answer the
think I'll-
question if someone else
It is-
proposes it.
it is Ms.
I think I'll
Ledger
reclaim my
Fernandez.
time on this, but this is an example. It is freewheeling, but it is an example of how we have moved beyond the idea that we are imposing on DC from Congress what should be happening. And I think it's up to the local voters.
Yes.
Do they want to continue electing council members and a mayor who are pursuing these policies?
And in that
That's up to them,
specific
isn't it?
case, there are, I think, something like 5,000 or 6,000 college and university campuses across the country, and they and their security forces have relationships with the local governments and the county governments and the state governments. They can't be micromanaged by the U.S. Congress. We're the federal legislature, and we're supposed to be engaged in federal lawmaking. So if there was a request from a campus to the DC police and to the mayor, and they engaged in a process that at first didn't give the university exactly what it wanted, and then it did end up doing it, I'd be happy to look at it, but that's how local government works, right? And does the Congress really want to be superintending the relationship between every college and university in all of our districts and the local and state governments? I don't think so. And to get back to the matter at hand, that's precisely the fatal flaw with this legislation, which is it says for all time, we're going to freeze criminal sentencing legislation in the District of Columbia at what it is. I don't know whether that was deliberate or not, but that's what their legislation says. They're going to make it impossible for the DC Council to do what it just did, which is to create new crimes like the crime of organized retail theft conspiracy rings. And that's not something that the Congress of the United States is going to do for DC, but it's something that DC did for itself, but now we wouldn't allow them to, simply because, we decide it's an election year and it's convenient to kick DC around a little bit.
So thank you very much, Ranking Member. And I would note, Madam Chairwoman, I'd like to enter into the record the Washington Post article that points out how Social Security and Medicare taxes have been benefited by immigrant participation.
Without objection.
And because it's not my word, these are actually several statistics. We've also looked at, there was a recent GAO study, CBO, which pointed out that immigrants, undocumented immigrants, have produced about $1 trillion of benefit to the United States economy, and we will also, I don't have that one on me right now, but I'll send it over to Mr. Norman's office. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you very much. And I yield to our colleague from Georgia, Mr. Scott.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Askins, I want to ask you one question. You used the term machine gun. Can you tell me how many crimes have ever been committed with a legally owned Class 3 weapon?
No.
I'm right here.
The answer was no. No. I invoked machine guns only to enumerate the offenses that have been adopted recently in the District of Columbia.
Okay. Let me, and I pulled up that, I think the answer is one, by the way. Legally owned Class 3 weapons, I think there was one crime committed.
I got you.
Okay.
So this
And I'm
is,
talking about nationwide.
this is with
I may be-
the federal criminal ban on the machine.
No, I'm talking about, you use the term machine gun, which
Yeah.
is a Class 3 weapon, and I'm talking about a legally owned Class 3 weapon. I think there's been one crime committed with a legally owned Class 3 weapon. So let's not confuse law-abiding gun owners with people who illegally own a Class 3 weapon.
I got you. The statute that I was invoking locally is one that punishes illegal ownership without a permit.
Okay, well, no, actually, it says no person shall possess. So even if you legally own one, you can't possess it in Washington, D.C. So the statute does not deal with legal ownership, and that's where those of us who legally own things and have permits to carry have issues. But I'm not going to go, I want to read you something else in the
Okay.
D.C. law.
Yeah.
No person shall within the District of Columbia possess with intent to use unlawfully against another an imitation pistol, or a dagger, dirk, razor, stiletto, or knife with a blade longer than 3 inches, or other dangerous weapon. I mean, they prohibit you from having anything inside the Washington area. And you cited some statistics, and I want to go to, I think you quoted the monthlies, though, because I want to give you the 22 to 23 statistics. According to the Washington, D.C. Metropolitan Police, homicide, 22 to 23, up 35%.
In 2023.
Between 2022 and 2023, it went
Yep.
up 35%. Now, 2024 is not over yet, to my knowledge, right? So the last full year stats,
Yeah.
it went up 35%. Violent crime went up 39% in Washington, D.C. from 22 to 23. So, I mean, there's clearly a problem here.
Well, yeah, I was just giving the comparative period for this year in the wake of their legislation, right?
You're talking about a month to month, though.
Right, by definition.
I mean,
yes.
but that's not,
It's the first half of the year. It was
It's not
January
a sta-
through May, yeah.
it's not a statistically, I'm a risk management guy. Statistically, you need to go on annual. You've got significant increases in violent crime in this area between 22 and 23. Now, here's my question. You're opposed to us saying that a 25-year-old is not a youth.
Well, actually, their statute, as I understand it, is 24-year-old. It's
Okay.
under 25. It's the same one that
So
exists.
24.
It's the same one that exists, I think it's in South Carolina.
Well, but constitutionally, we don't have control over what South Carolina does. It's different with Washington, D.C.
Well, I wonder about that. I mean, you don't think that we could pass a nationwide law on this subject?
I think it is very different with regard to, I think you can have honest differences of opinion with regard to what Congress's role in Washington, D.C. is from a governance standard and what it is in
Okay.
in
So
the
then it
states.
becomes a
But
policy question, yeah.
fair enough. But my point is this. Violent crime has gone up significantly in Washington, D.C.
Not this year. It's gone down significantly.
From
This-
22 to 23, it went up 35%.
Right.
So if it went down 35%, it's still back to the 22 levels. Look, I support the bill. I think it's ridiculous that anyone would say that a 24-year-old is a youth, and especially when it comes to violent crime. If someone is a violent person, they're not going to change. They're just not going to change. And so I hope we pass the rule, I hope we pass the bill, and I hope the Senate will do their job and pass it as well.
Thank you very much, and there's no one else who wishes to ask questions, so I thank you both for appearing here today, and the witnesses are excused. I would like to welcome our second panel, who have been patiently waiting, Representative Andy Biggs and Ranking Member Jerry Nadler from the Committee on Judiciary.